This is a program being co-sponsored by the Program in Judaic Studies as well as the Watson Institute. And so I want to welcome Daniel Sherman. Daniel Sherman is a strategic and organizational consultant focusing on peace and development issues. Educated at Vassar College, Hebrew University, and the London School of Economics, he has served as a senior general staff officer in the Israel Defense Forces Strategic Planning Division, where he worked on the Israeli-Palestinian peace process and Israel's defense-oriented international relations. He's also been the director of the Middle East Division of the Negev Institute for Strategies of Peace and Development, which included work designing programs involving cooperation between Israelis and Palestinians in areas of women's empowerment, small business development, and environmental building. He has held the position of International Relations Director for the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, where he was responsible for engagement with diplomats and international policymakers, and he has held positions at the Joint Distribution Committee, developing social welfare programs for disadvantaged Jewish communities in Central and Eastern Europe. He is also the founder of Yuvalim, an innovative project that promotes peace and shared society in Israel by linking communal networks with visionary Israeli leaders and with outstanding organizations working to solve Jewish, Arab, and Israeli-Palestinian conflicts. In an article by Daniel Sherman that appeared in the Times of Israel, he wrote of the vision that guides him in his work as an Israeli seeking the resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. In reference to Israelis and Palestinians, he wrote, quote, "We must maintain our confidence in our abilities through our creativity and actions to improve our lives and societies together. In the context of Israel, the essence of Zionism is the stubborn refusal to sit quietly on the sidelines of history, but rather to step onto the stage as actors able to forge a new drama and to contribute in a positive manner to what we hope will be a wondrous and constantly improving Jewish and more broadly human story." He goes on to write, "A key to doing this is hope, the hope that we together can build a better future. Sadly, we are both weary and wary. These are feelings honestly come by through more recent and distant history alike, but we must speak about hope and build from this." This past January, when I led a study tour of Israel-Palestine with Brown students, we were fortunate to hear Daniel Sherman's insights on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And when I heard that he would be in the U.S. this spring, I invited him to share these insights with the wider Brown academic community. We're pleased to have with us Dr. Shani Moore, a postdoctoral research fellow at the Political Theory Project here at Brown, to serve as a respondent to Daniel Sherman's talk. Finally, I want to conclude with an expression of gratitude to the Watson Institute for co-sponsoring this event and providing the Joukowsky Forum as its location. Daniel Sherman will speak to us this afternoon on Israeli and Palestinian peace, opportunities, and risks. After his talk, immediately after his talk, Shani Moore will present a response, and then we will open up for questions and comments from the audience. So please join me in welcoming Daniel Sherman.
David, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm tempted to say let's conclude there. And thank you, Shani, for agreeing to appear today, and thank you, of course, to the Watson Center. In thinking about how to begin this talk, I was reminded of a visit that I had while I was working at B'Tselem, a human rights organization in a small village called Nebi Saleh. Nebi Saleh is a village where there are ongoing protests involving access of the village to a local spring, and there's a group of activists there who all come from the Tamimi family. Everyone in Nebi Saleh is from that family, and I was sitting with one of the leaders of the group, and we had some time to kill before a diplomat was going to join us, and I realized I'd never actually spoken to her about anything besides the conflict. And I asked, a bit about what she'd studied, what she did, and I was surprised to discover that, not surprised but pleasantly surprised that she had studied literature, English literature, which was interesting. And so I asked her, Manal Tamimi, so what's your favorite book? And she said, well, actually, I really like The Old Man and the Sea, which also I was a little surprised by. And then, because the conflict is never too far away, she went on to say she thinks it reminds her very much of the conflict of Palestine. She says, I'm quite confident that we will make a state. Every day, every weekend when we have the protests, every time someone's arrested, every time we have to cope with some element of this ongoing occupation from her perspective, I think we will get there. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of we will. But she also said, just like in The Old Man and the Sea, we're facing a very difficult situation where I don't know what it is we're going to be bringing into the port. Okay, and and I think that's really an image that I think will guide this, what I will try to convey to you about opportunities from this point forward, still reaching a peace and a two-state solution with Israelis and between Israelis and Palestinians, but also a warning sign. Right now, there is a fish of some size that is being pulled behind the boat of the old man who's trying to make his way back to port, but there are a lot of things that can happen. I'm not sure if I certainly wouldn't describe the ending of The Old Man and the Sea as a happy, optimistic ending per se. But I would have to say that when looking at the risks, I think we have a risk of it ending much more poorly than it ended in the book, and that's actually on the somewhat depressing side. I think there is a huge storm in the region that can sink the boat, sink the old man, get rid of I'm less confident that than Manal Tamimi is and some other Palestinians that I know that they will definitely get the Palestinian state that they wish. There are sharks in the water, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Basically, in this talk, I'd like to discuss what are using really two images, one of a shaking up. What are some of the opportunities that we have because of the tremendous shaking up that's happening in the region, both amongst Israelis and Palestinians, but more specifically amongst the region writ fairly broadly, as well as within the world. And also some of the dangers, specific dangers that come not just from the shaking up, but also from a potential shaking off. An intifada in Arabic is, one reading of that is that it's a shaking off. And I think we have opportunities from a shaking up. We have some opportunities from a bit of a shaking off of some of the leadership that we have both in Israel and amongst the Palestinians. And we have tremendous risks that come from what could be the implications of a shaking off. Okay, and another thing that I would also like to highlight is that because of the tremendous uncertainty that we have in the region at present, we're facing a situation where we could also end up with shifts or types of changes in the region that are quite dramatic, but also quite unexpected, and also linked to uncertainty and miscalculation. If one looks we're now approaching the 50th anniversary of the 1967 Six-Day War. If we look at how the Six-Day War came about, I think current scholarship is pointing that it was based on miscalculation by Arab leaders, by Israeli leaders, and that it wasn't based on an intent by any of the leaders at the time to achieve certain specific aims through a war. If we look at some of the more recent wars, if we look at the most recent war in Lebanon or the most recent wars in Gaza, those are also based on a level of uncertainty that caused miscalculation on the part of both the Palestinian, the Hezbollah leaders, and also within Israel about what steps needed to be taken. And I think those are tremendous risks. And in this talk, I'll try to present a sort of a broader systemic analysis of the situation in the region and how it's affecting the actions of Israelis and Palestinians. But I also think it's important not to forget the possibility and the potential for miscalculation and uncertainty to lead to quite dramatic and not very opportune results. So I'm going to try to do three things. I'll discuss the broader regional perspective, giving an overview of what the dynamics are, what the actors are, what some of the risk factors exist, but also how that opens up some potential for change. taking a further step out, in the context also of the regional perspective, I'll also discuss the outlines of what a regional approach means, both to some of the Arab states, but also possibly what a regional approach could mean for Israel. A broader international perspective, essentially looking at the United States and Russia and how some of the broader international perspective can also impact the region, and then drill down a bit more to looking at Israeli and Palestinian perspectives. Okay, so coming to the subject of a regional approach. It's been discussed fairly widely. I don't think anything that I'm going to say is going to be tremendously new with respect to that, but I'd just like to review why a regional approach offers some opportunities, and also why some of the shifts and uncertainty in the region can cause, and the shakeup is causing sort of a new alignment that can be that lends itself to a regional approach. While I would have to say, and here also I'm cutting very much to the chase, I think the possibility of reaching a final solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is rather low right now. The conditions really are not good. I think I do think that there are levels and possibilities of reaching a regional. I guess collaboration is too strong a term and is weighted perhaps in some unpleasant ways, but I do think that it's possible for pragmatic actors within the region to cooperate and coordinate for a number of reasons. The first is with respect to Iran. Now, with Iran as a threat that is being the idea of an expansionist Iran that's Shiite, that is seeking nuclear weapons, is something that is tremendously threatening to a broad number of Shiite actors in the region. We see that many groups are trying to do things such as present Iran's expansion both within the Gulf, but also its expansion much more broadly throughout the Middle East, all the way through Syria. With respect to Syria, there's a clear desire to reach some sort of a stable situation in Syria, and that's reducing the instability, and that is caused primarily because of the need to reduce the instability that's caused by the continuing efforts of ISIS which seems very much in retreat at this point, and other radical groups to strengthen themselves within the region. But that also creates a confluence of interest between Israel and the Palestinian states. Israel doesn't want to see these groups stronger. It certainly doesn't want to see certainly doesn't want to see Iran become stronger and extend itself through to the Mediterranean, or extend itself most specifically in the border areas adjacent to Israel and also adjacent to Jordan. Those are some very key strategic interests that Israel has, and that aligns very well with some of the interests of some of the Sunni states. And of the Sunni states, most particularly, I'd refer to Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Jordan, and then Egypt, which fits into a slightly special category. The final piece, and this is something that people don't always examine as closely as I think they ought to, is the incredible threat that the economic and demographic challenges place towards the Muslim states that I mentioned. They face tremendous issues of demographic growth. If we look at a 1.8, sorry, and everyone can hear me, I think? Yes? Great. Okay. I could be louder, so I will try to be louder. Thanks. So if we look at a 1.8% year-on demographic growth amongst the populations of the region, these are very broad numbers. We're looking at within the broader region of the Middle East, we're looking at between 80 and 100 million people unemployed by 2030. That's a lot of people. This is a tremendous threat to the continued rule of states like Saudi Arabia, and Egypt is obviously dealing with this as well. At present, there are some 40% of young people in Egypt are unemployed. These are major threats to the stability of the rule. It has nothing to do with Israel whatsoever. It has nothing to do with the Palestinians. Again, a lot of these factors have nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian issue. Is a side issue to basic main central threats to the rule to regime stability, and that's quite critical. So the shaking up that's caused by Iran, that's caused by the Syrian crisis, that's caused by the demographic and economic challenges, are all things that are causing some of these Arab states to look and say, what can we do to improve our situation in some way? And one of the things, and this is also helped along by the idea that the United States is perhaps making a shift away from the Middle East. That's something that obviously has been considered for some time, happened to a certain extent under the Obama administration. I don't want to overstate to the extent to which it happened, although there was a perception of that beginning. And it's causing many of the actors to say, okay, if we have to rely on ourselves, who can we work with? Let's work with one of a stable, powerful regime in the region, and that's Israel. The big limiting factor, the factor that limits them with respect to their own populations in engaging with Israel more strongly and more openly, really is the Israel-Palestine problem. In saying this, I don't mean to understate or underemphasize the extent to which they truly want to help the Palestinians, which I think is also there. So the general shaking up in the region caused by all of these factors is causing a desire to work more closely with Israel. In order to work more closely with Israel, they have to solve the Israeli-Palestinian problem. This led to Saudi Arabia in 2002 to promote or to launch the Saudi Peace Initiative, which was then adopted by the Arab League, excuse me, which was then adopted by the Arab League, and then it was reaccepted even most recently in the meeting that just happened in Jordan. So they accepted the idea of an Arab Peace Initiative, which essentially said that there will be full normalization in return to talks based on the 67 lines. That has been adjusted by the Saudis and accepted by the Arab League, accepting the idea that there could be some potential land swaps, which is a very interesting thing. That a just solution will be made to the Palestinian refugee issue, based again on UN General Assembly Resolution 194. This could be a bit of a problem for Israel, so there needs to be some flexibility perhaps there, and there needs to be an answer to the question of Jerusalem. I'm going to just look now before going on to the analysis of the international balance of power and issues and looking at the Israeli and Palestinian response to this, just to look very briefly about how the different actors are responding to the Arab Peace Initiative. From Israel's perspective, I think it offers Israel some very unique opportunities. It can achieve one of its longstanding desires and strategic objectives to achieve full normalization with the Arab world, which would tremendously improve Israel's strategic position vis-a-vis a range of actors and in the region. It could reduce the likelihood of periodic wars in Gaza. It could strengthen Israel's stance vis-a-vis the threat that it faces from its north, primarily from Hezbollah, but also from Iran, and certainly help Israel in dealing with the expansionist nature of Iran. Expansionist nature, and as well as the nuclear issue, although it's really the expansionist nature of Iran that is of concern to Israel, I believe. It also has the possible benefit from Israel's perspective of promoting stability within its neighboring Arab states. One of the things that tremendously threatens Israel right now is looking at Syria and saying, wow, we really don't want to see that happening in Jordan. We don't want to see chaos happen in Egypt. We don't want to see Saudi Arabia descend into turmoil. Regional chaos is a tremendous threat. That's also one of the reasons why Europe will needs to stay as involved as it is in the region. From the Palestinians, it's problematic for a number of reasons. The shaking up is causing the Palestinians to feel quite threatened. There's a very weak Palestinian Authority right now. It's obviously divided between the Palestinian Authority that's in control of the West Bank and Hamas that's in control now in Gaza. The general approval rating of the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank is in the teens, which is quite a difficult thing for the Palestinians. Paradoxically, it's quite low for Hamas in Gaza as well. But this shaking up is causing people to say, wow, we need to find some way of delivering something to our populations. That could conceivably make it a bit easier to sell compromises that the Palestinian Authority was not willing to take at this point in time, and that is significantly enhanced and changed by some sort of envelope that the Arab states could provide to the Palestinian Authority. So that's the political cover that could be provided in the context of a regional approach is really quite valuable for the Palestinian leadership right now. One of the things that it offers, I guess, is in terms of and here's something that I would like to add, which is not generally, certainly not from with respect to the Arab Peace Initiative, but it's the idea of a phased approach. The Arab Peace Initiative essentially envisions starting right now and dealing with the core issues, Israel making compromises, then there being advancement at the same time with full normalization. It seems, and what I propose, as well as a number of others, is that we need to stretch that period out, and I'll speak about that a bit more in the future. But a phased regional approach, to my mind, offers a political horizon for Israelis and Palestinians, which is useful to all, based on borders and land swaps, preserves settlement blocks, provides security, and it will be based on some sort of agreed solutions to Jerusalem and refugees. The great fortune that we have is that of all the conflicts in the world, our conflict happens to be very well researched. A lot of the details of how these things can be worked out are very well understood in terms of where potential trade-offs are. In terms of the region, it provides all of the actors in the region, with the exception of Iran, Hezbollah, ISIS, Hamas, and Al-Qaeda, a response to exactly those actors. So that is something that can be really useful for everyone. It also includes what I would suggest is immediate actions that can be taken to reduce the threat of war, of a much greater shaking up, and also potentially a shaking off with respect to Lebanon with Hezbollah and Gaza with respect to Hamas, which is dangerous for everyone. And then the final piece is that it offers economic mechanisms that will promote both cooperatively but also individually the development of all of the economies of the region in a way that's beneficial to all. I welcome questions on that, because that also can be, offers some difficulties as well with new areas of competition between Israel and the Arab states as a possible problematic issue. I'd like to move now to looking at the international perspective. And from this perspective, I mean to take a look at where the United States is, how the United States can possibly play a role, as well as some of the issues specifically with respect to Trump and the Trump presidency, which causes, which I have no great crystal ball. If anyone has more insight than I do on this, I definitely welcome it and the period for questions and comments. And I would also like to discuss Russia's potential role and why Russia is increasingly important and actually a huge stumbling block in everything that I'm about to say. So just let's keep that in mind. With respect to Trump, I can say very clearly and with 100% certainty that there are conflicting and paradoxical dynamics that are set up. So I hope we can perhaps agree on that. I think on the one hand there's a shaking up. That shaking up is causing everyone to try to reevaluate how do we, if there's a storm that's happening and there are winds of change and we don't know exactly what they are, how do we where can we seek some sorts of stability? That's pushing people perhaps farther than they otherwise would have gone, and there are some opportunities there. What I would like to say very clearly is that it represents a shift from from at least some of Obama's views in the Middle East. That there's most specifically, there's a re-engagement in the region that was as opposed to the signals of a disengagement from the region. I just want to review 8 things that Trump seems to have said. He's made a commitment to actively engage in peacemaking. We don't know how strong that is, but he made the signal. He sent a signal that he's willing to use force in the region, a moderate signal. It's also not clear how far that's going to go. Something that I think is a bit more positive, and I think at least the actors that I've spoken to have seemed to be interested and impressed by it. Jason Greenblatt, who was Trump's special envoy for international negotiations, was sent to Israel and to speak with the Palestinian Authority. He spoke also with a range of actors, both within the business community, among civil society organizations, diplomats. He also attended the recent Arab League summit, which was held in Amman. And across the board, And it's has been very well reported in the press. People were tremendously impressed by what he had to say. He listened very carefully. He gave some very clear signals that the Trump administration was not going to be a great friend of the settlers without terribly upsetting anyone. And he showed a seriousness of purpose, and that's a messaging that is much stronger than I'm going to put my son-in-law in charge of things. And by the way, we haven't seen his son-in-law very lately in this context. That can be interpreted in a number of different ways, but it is interesting. He invited Abbas to meet him. Trump invited Abbas to meet him at the White House, a visit that's going to be happening, I think, next week, if I'm not mistaken. He backed away from his promises to move the embassy to Jerusalem. Also interesting. Didn't cancel it completely, and there's been some interesting discussion of how a possible move of the embassy to the U.S. embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem could even be conducted in a way that could actually help move the peace process or the political process along with the Palestinians. I think it's actually quite interesting, and if anyone wants to ask during the period about Russia's view about this, that gives another. That adds another level of complication, I think. He's pressed Netanyahu to limit settlement construction. This, I think, is actually quite a key one. He has not, the far religious, ideological right, saw anyone but Hillary Clinton being elected as a positive thing, seeing Hillary Clinton as an extension of an Obama administration. And they also figured with Trump, given the statements that he made with respect to Jerusalem, given his closeness with Friedman, who has since appointed as ambassador to Israel, given his lack of real knowledge of the region and perhaps his desire not to get so involved, he thought that would offer Trump a tremendous. Trump would be the one that would allow Israel's right to finally achieve some of its aims of annexing all of the West Bank, or of making some very significant moves that would be quite powerful. While there are those on the right who still believe that there's much more that the Netanyahu government can do, there's much more space under the Trump administration to move in this direction, I think Netanyahu is very wary of this. And I think Trump has also signaled most specifically and most publicly in his press conference with Netanyahu's press conference together with Trump, when he made what was essentially an off-the-cuff remark, and it's important not to read too much into off-the-cuff remarks, but he said very clearly, he said, listen, these settlements are probably not so helpful, aren't they? And he said it in such a way that Trump, who was bending over backwards to avoid having any kind of conflict and to show any daylight between his views and Trump's views, couldn't say anything. So it was a statement of a position about the settlements, which I think is going to be followed through, and from both American diplomats as well as officials and others in Israel who have engaged with American diplomats. I'm hearing that message is coming through quite clearly, and I think Netanyahu understood that as well. And we see in Netanyahu's own behavior that represents his recognition that he by no means has a green light to move ahead in settlement construction. And then last but not least, in terms of confused messages, he appointed David Friedman, who's a very right-leaning American Jew who has supported some of the most radical settlements in the West Bank. He has that signals something. We're not quite sure what. What does this constitute? This constitutes a very high level of uncertainty. But there are also some positive signals that are there, and overall some very dangerous ones. And again, I recognize that it doesn't hugely clarify the situation for us. What is very important to focus on in all of this are the opportunities that this opens up for us. It opens up the opportunities again because the instability and the volatility is a cause for people to seek some shelter. And this push that all of the actors in the region are seeking to find something that they can link their futures in a stable way to creates movement that can be very potentially fruitful. I think Netanyahu is deeply concerned about how he can insulate himself from pressure from Trump. I don't think he's going to succeed in doing that. If he's not able to do that, that could be an additional push to an Israeli politician who's under a considerable amount of threat, and that's something that is of danger to Netanyahu. But that means that Israel could conceivably be more flexible both under Netanyahu to make certain moves, but it also means that there could be a new leadership that Trump could, because of Trump's instability, could help in some ways to be the final straw that breaks this current government's back. The other thing that I think we need to look at with respect to the United States is the potential for distraction, and that's also one of the risks of everything that anything related to Trump that is really clear to everyone. I don't possibly even to Trump himself, but this kind of distraction could be very practically based because of the U.S. and Russia are clearly playing much broader global games that have where what happens in North Korea obviously is going to affect what's happening in the Middle East. A flare-up in North Korea, for example, that's dealt with decisively, clearly, with some kind of leadership, even if it doesn't come from Trump but comes from others within his administration, could demonstrate to other actors around the world, including within the Middle East, that there is something that we need to deal very seriously with pressure or from the United States and with U.S. leadership. To my mind, I think the more likely scenario is actually one of the instability that's going to come when the United States either fails to accomplish objectives in a place like North Korea or Central Europe or anywhere else around the world, and then it becomes either bogged down or distracted, and also generally the ability or the confidence that any partners will have in what it can do will be diminished. So that's something that's quite dangerous. Very quickly with respect to Russia, I think it's there are just two things I think that are important to note. The first is that Russia is no longer in the position of playing a spoiler on the global stage. Following the breakup of the Soviet Union, there were things that Russia could prevent from happening in the Middle East specifically, but globally as well. They were fairly limited, but it was essentially was in the role of a spoiler, I'd like to suggest. That's no longer the case right now. It is clearly projecting itself into the Middle East in a way that is much more powerful, much more forceful, and to a certain extent enabled by American policy, which withdrew to a certain extent. The other, and this is parallel to what I just said about the United States, is that the Russians are playing a much broader game. They have very clear interests in their near abroad, in the other parts of the world, including Central Europe, in the Baltics, etc. And what happens in their decision making with respect to the Middle East has elements to do, obviously, with their interests specifically with respect to the Middle East, but they can make trade-offs in other areas, and that's hugely dangerous for those actors in the Middle East. And this is precisely because Israel recognizes that some of its key strategic objectives can only be achieved with Russian support. And I'm thinking specifically of achieving a situation where Iran doesn't extend itself through to the Mediterranean, and where Hezbollah isn't able to deploy itself along Israel's border with Syria and along Israel's border with Jordan. There's the additional element of the weapon systems, which has already been shifted with the introduction of the S-300 anti-aircraft missiles, which now it has not yet limited Israel's operational capacity actually it's limited it somewhat, but Israel has still been operating freely. But these types of shifts are things that Israel is very sensitive to and pose a direct threat to Israel. Okay, now I'm getting to the Palestinians. I already mentioned that there's the split between the West Bank and Gaza, which one needs to consider when thinking about the Palestinians. It's important to analyze anything that's happening amongst the Palestinian authority and their decision-making, both with respect to the peace process or the political process with Israel, but actually anything to the battle for succession of Abbas, which has already begun amongst the Palestinians. It's perhaps unclear to anyone how far the ultimate strength of the Palestinian Authority. So miscalculation by any of a number of actors can really cause the collapse of this is again the shaking off of the Palestinian role, the collapse of the Palestinian Authority, and that's quite dangerous. And then the final piece, I think, is this is on the positive side, because there is this instability in the broader region. Because of this weakness, paradoxically, that can also, with sufficient support from outside in the form of a protective envelope from a regional perspective, as well as confidence-building steps on the part of that are by Israel, and also a supportive environment that's enabled by the international community writ large. And here I'm speaking specifically of Europe and the United States. I think that's something that can push a Palestinian leadership, probably in a more limited sense under Abbas, in a greater sense under a future Palestinian leadership, to make concessions to Israel within the context of a regional approach. What I would like to do just very, very briefly right now also is to make to take a step back and to look at some of the dynamics that led to the first Intifada and the shaking off there and the current conditions. What I would like to suggest is that it was really a pattern of neglect, both by a Palestinian leadership, this is prior to the first Intifada, as well as by the Arab states and the rest of the world, of the Palestinian problem inside of the West Bank and Gaza that led to the first Intifada. We have a 1985 emergency summit of the Arab League in Casablanca, which ended inconclusively. The only reason I'm mentioning that is so that I can quote from the Chicago Tribune that reported on this, and with the statement, amid the deep divisions and uncertainty, an emergency summit of the Arab League ended Friday without giving an endorsement to a Jordanian-Palestinian peace initiative that Arab architects have called, quote, the last feasible chance for Middle East peace. Okay, so that was back in 1985. And then we have, which I think is, I like to remind myself of that, because that's also, we keep saying this is the end, this is the end, this is the end, and there keeps being something that keeps moving on until there's a sudden change, perhaps. We have the 1987 Arab League summit in Amman, which did not deal with the Palestinian issue at all. Okay, that was actually quite critical. Instead, it was focused where? It was focused on Iran and Iraq. And then December 1987, what do we have? We have the first Intifada. And I guess what I'd like to suggest, and why this is relevant to us, is because I think it's precisely this pattern of benign neglect that is ultimately what led to a shaking off by the Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza at the time of their attempt to give up this forbearance. There's the Arabic term of sumud, which is, we're going to maintain our. It's the Palestinian movement outside of Palestine that's going to deal with the issues, and the role of the people inside of the West Bank and Gaza is just to kind of sit quietly. They said, enough of this, we don't trust, we want to take care of things ourselves, we want to get rid of this rule that we feel is oppressive to us. And the other piece that people, I think, frequently forget is that there was also a shaking off, an intifada of the Palestinian leadership, the PLO at the time, which somehow at the time managed to come back and reestablish itself in a way that led to and facilitated the Oslo process. Because in order to have negotiations, you need to have someone to talk to who's able actually to follow through with with something. That really seems not to be the case right now. I think we have a similar situation where the Palestinian street is tremendously upset and has very little confidence in the Palestinian Authority, which it views as corrupt and not able to deliver the goods. The big difference here is that if there is this grassroots uprising, which will be very different, more similar to the first Intifada, I would think, than the second Intifada, which was much more organized and based on social structures, that's going to be something that's going to leave a huge gap. That gap could potentially be filled by Hamas. It could be potentially filled by other groups, but it's really one of these questions of we just don't know. We don't know who's there, and it doesn't seem like there is any other leadership that can step in from the wings and that anyone will really be able to talk to in a significant way. And that's a very dangerous thing. It also means that it's much more important for there to be consistent signals from the American administration or from the United States writ more broadly, of continued interest and engagement. It means that continued engagement, interest, and continued funding from the European Union and from individual European states, which are presently are the largest donors to the Palestinian Authority, are of continued importance. It means that as well that civil society organizations also need to have a significant role to play, because one of the unfortunate, to my mind, implications of what has happened amongst Palestinian society, partly because of the failure of the Oslo process to move ahead, and also partly as a result of some of the security mechanisms that are in existence right now, supported by Israel, also supported by the Palestinian Authority, is that there's been a bit of an atomization that's happened amongst the Palestinian Authority, amongst the Palestinian society, that is not really conducive to the types of community organization that is really necessary if you want to have some kind of stability at the end of the day. So that's kind of a dangerous situation, and one that we need to be quite cautious about. For Israel, I don't want to go. I'm happy to discuss during the question period a deeper analysis of the Israeli political situation, but I just want to note 4 points with respect to Israel. The first is that we've got the farthest right government in Israel that the country has ever had. Many people from the Likud party, the majority of the Likud party, is to the right of Netanyahu. Netanyahu himself is, I would describe as a pragmatic ideologue. He's right-wing himself, but the Likud party is farther to the right, by and large, than he is. It means that a shift in leadership of the Likud party is probably going to pull the Likud farther right than it is at present, and it could conceivably make the Likud party less pragmatic. Netanyahu himself is under a police investigation. There are a number of, it's not a single investigation, there are a number of open investigations. Should he be indicted, while he's not legally required to step down, it seems to my mind it is unlikely or unimaginable, not unlikely, that he would be able to continue to stay as prime minister. So that now, it's the word on the street is really that nothing, a recommendation to indict or not indict could lead to such an action being taken only come late autumn 2017 or the early part of 2018. So Netanyahu himself has a bit of time to play with, and there are different types of things that he can do, possibly to push off a police indictment. That one of those could be calling new elections. But it's a very unstable situation with respect to Netanyahu, but he's under tremendous threat from within his own Likud party and also from others amongst the right, especially the farther right, to unseat him. So it seems unlikely that he's going to get to the 2019 point of completing his term. And the final piece is that should the government fall and new elections be called, it seems very unlikely, this is not such great news, but it seems very unlikely that there's going to be a new government chosen that will have a strong mandate to advance a political process to a final status solution. This means that the possible maneuvering room is relatively slow, and it sets a new government up, it sets up the potential for there being a new government that may be able to advance towards in a political process, but probably will not be able to bring it to a conclusion. There are a couple of things that could change this. One is the emergence of a new center-left or left-leaning leadership, which could either create a new party or revitalize one of the existing parties. I'm aware of at least 3 different efforts that are currently underway to do exactly that. It's not clear how far any of them will go. And the second thing, and these two cannot obviously happen together, the second is a potential war. It's completely conceivable that we'll have another war in Gaza. There are all the signs of things heating up. And it's also equally conceivable that we could have another war involving Israel and Hezbollah and a range of other actors. Also, again, when one considers the Russian involvement in Syria and the alignment of Russia for pragmatic reasons both with Hezbollah and with Syria's Assad, this becomes a very dangerous situation. But all of these are things that could happen, not because anyone wants them to happen, but based out of miscalculation. So should there be a war, that could dramatically affect where the Israeli body politic is. Where does this leave us? Okay, it leaves us basically in a very dangerous and tough environment. It doesn't mean most Israelis are really not terribly confident or about a bright future over the next over the short period. But it does also leave, as I've tried to stress, it leaves us with opportunities to take advantage of how this shaking up of the region and what that's done. Again, very, very dangerous with some possibilities. So what I would like to suggest is that the introduction of a staged regional process is one which holds the best possibility of enabling the actors of the region to move forward in a staged manner. This, again, I refer to the staged element as important, around a political solution whose basic parameters are known. The first is border adjustments and land swaps. The land swaps will allow Israel, as many of you already know, I would think, will enable Israel to maintain the larger settlement blocks, meaning it won't have to move large numbers of settlers, and at the same time swapping equal amounts of land to the Palestinians, so that it will compensate for the land that was taken. This is by no means something that is fully accepted by the Arab street, or even partially accepted by the Arab street. They see this as a tremendous concession. Even those Palestinians who are willing to adopt this type of framework. But it has been worked out by a number of different Track 2 groups, and there's been a tremendous amount of research about exactly where this land can be. Where the borders can be drawn, exactly how many people will be moved and not moved, et cetera, et cetera. The second thing is, I think there need to be some very practical steps taken to relieve the hardship in Gaza. That's the situation in Gaza is utterly unbearable. The drinking water is no longer viable. And the threat of an explosion there is ever present and quite dangerous. The advantage with Gaza is that unilateral steps can be taken at the level of solving one problem, which is relieving some of the extreme hardship which can contribute to an explosion in Gaza, and then the second piece is helping to create a positive sense of a willingness, at least on Israel's part, that Israel is sensitive to the needs of the Palestinians on the one hand, and also willing to move forward on and advance, doesn't see the weakening of Palestinians in any way possible as something that's an objective of Israel. The third is a freeze on settlement construction, at least within settlement blocks. This is a touchy one. I'll leave it at that. I'm sure there will be questions on that. But that's something that's going to be, on the one hand, very difficult for any potential Israeli government to implement, certainly a right-leaning government. This is when Netanyahu takes some steps in this direction, which he already has done. That's something which is already drawing the lines of conflict on the right. But that's something that needs to happen, and it needs to happen in such a way that the Palestinians see that there's a shift. A lot of these points, again, are geared to sending signals to the Palestinians. You can continue not to throw off the Palestinian Authority. You can continue. Your life is better now than it will be under any possible future if there's an explosion. Let's not have an explosion. There needs to be development in Area C. This is under the Oslo process. There was a division of areas A, B, and C, where A are the main population centers, B are where the Palestinian Authority has complete control, including security control, B, where the Palestinian Authority has control over the population, but not entirely over security, and then area C, where all of the settlements are located. It's just under 60% of the land, and of the West Bank, and it's also where Israel has full control. By opening up the Area C to development for the use of Palestinians who are living in Area C, but also to Palestinians living adjacent to Area C, which are all of the Palestinians in the West Bank, that can, on the one hand, ease a tremendous amount of pressure, economic and social pressure, on the Palestinian population living in these areas. And then the second thing that it can do, which is just as important, is it sends a signal that Israel is serious about making concessions, and that signal needs to be pressed forward. And then the fifth is dealing somehow with East Jerusalem, sending signals that Israel is limiting expansion of Jewish Israeli settlement inside of Arab East Jerusalem. So there can be a viable sense of the Palestinians having a future capital in Jerusalem, which I think is going to be important in a future deal. And then the last piece is some sort of symbolic development of land that in the future will be swapped with Israel. There's nothing preventing Israel from if Israel is going to be taking unilateral steps with respect to continued settlement construction within settlement blocks, it is possible for Israel also to take unilateral steps, partly to balance this out, but also partly as a message to the Palestinians and the rest of the world that it's serious about these land swaps. So as a very simple thing, it could do something like building solar electric fields on lands that are adjacent to the Gaza periphery. It's not critical. It probably won't. That's not what the land will probably be used for, but it can provide some direct electricity, which Gaza needs, and it sends a signal to the Palestinians that we're serious. This land, we're holding this land in trust for you. It can be yours under these circumstances. And it also sends a signal, which is just as important, that it's testing, that the Palestinians need to see that an Israeli leadership can be tested and it will be willing to make concessions, because the Palestinians right now are quite skeptical of this. Anyway, I do want to stress that the staged piecemeal element of this is quite problematic. Yeah, thanks. And I also would like to say that this is by no means something that we can guarantee is moving forward, but it is something that I think is possible if we want to go back to the idea of the old man in the sea and the imagery that comes from that. We're still very much at sea. The storm is a very real one. It's really quite dangerous. Hopefully the fact that there's storm clouds on the horizon can focus people's minds a bit. And now to bring it back to America, I think Mark Twain once said something about a hanging being something that can focus attention quite well. Let's hope that this situation does that and we'll be able to get into a safe harbor. Thank you. I'm sorry about the time. Yeah.
How much time should I speak for?
About 10, 15 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Daniel. That was a really interesting talk, and thank you for sending me the paper. I really enjoyed reading it. Is this better?
Yes.
All right. I mean, all you guys missed was the pleasantries, but I can repeat them. Thank you, Daniel. I enjoyed the talk very much. Thank you for sending me the paper. I enjoyed reading it. I enjoyed it a bit too much, perhaps. I was really hoping that there'd be something that I'd really object to, that I would disagree with very strongly, that I could occupy everyone with a lot of comments on. And I'm afraid a lot of my comments are either very narrow or very broad. I really like the construction of the shaking off and the shaking up. Shaking off, as Daniel was saying, is a rough Arabic translation of the word Intifada. And I find particularly compelling the comparison to the 1980s, but I think part of that is because I find the comparison compelling to various other things. I think there were a few factors in that pattern of neglect, some of which you mention and some of which you leave out. and I'm not even sure that neglect is necessarily the right term. There's certainly in the 1980s a big disengagement of the Arab states from the Palestinian issue. Part of that has to do with the process of digesting the enormous shift that the Egyptian-Israeli peace meant for the region. And part of that has to do with really big things that were really occupying the Arab world at the time, particularly the revolution in Iran and all of its after effects, and the Iran-Iraq War. You mentioned that all they talked about was the Iran-Iraq War. It almost sounded like that was kind of a criticism, but there were 1 million people killed in that war. And every decade of the Middle East has given us some theater for some horrific bout of carnage that has nothing to do with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, that sucks in various Middle Eastern actors, that upends entire regional alliance systems, and importantly for the West, that in places of complete chaos and state failure becomes a hotbed for international terrorism. See under Lebanon of the 1980s, or Yemen, or Libya, or other places. And there's no reason to think that the state collapse, that the current cycle of state collapse that began in 2011 is particularly different in that sense. The other thing that was really true in 1987 that I feel is very true now was a certain Israeli complacency about the occupation itself, that it's not a good thing. Someday we'd like to end it, but we think we found a formula for managing it right now. It's astonishing to me to read back the way Israelis talked in that long, lazy summer of 1987, 20 years after the war, 20 years into Israeli control of those territories, and months before what seemed like a stable status quo was about to collapse, never to be rebuilt again. And it's astonishing to me to read that overconfidence, that sense of, hey, look, nobody really wanted this. We can't think of a better way. We've really found a way to manage this on a day-to-day basis. And one of the frustrating things, of course, is that the creative periods in dealing with that are usually either during the peak of violence or more often immediately after. During a violent outbreak, people aren't terribly creative. They're worried about dealing with it. And then there's always the cycle of new thinking. And then there's the stasis. And I think that not only are we with an Arab world that's dealing with lots of more pressing problems, but we're dealing with an Israeli politics that that feels, and with a large measure of justification in the last 15 years, that it's figured it out, at least for the here and now. And it did figure it out, and by the way. Figured it out when most of the world was very skeptical. If you read what people said in 2002, 3, 4 about what Israel's options were and what it could possibly do, and that there was no possible way that Israel could ever put down an uprising like this, well, they were wrong. So all those things were there. I think of this, and I want to say a few things. In particular, I think a lot of the things I disagreed with the most was your presentation of the Israeli domestic political situation. But I don't think that was particularly crucial to the rest of the analysis of the paper. So I might just skip that for now, and we can get to that later. I like the way you organize the architecture of the problem. I think of it slightly differently, though. I go in 4 levels. I think of a global structure and how it affects this, particularly a superpower structure, a broad regional structure, a narrow regional one of just of the Arab-Israeli dispute, and then the bilateral issues of the Israelis and the Palestinians. On the broad regional structure, again, I want to zoom out a bit. I think there's a pretty clear picture of 2 trends that aren't exactly simultaneous, but they're 2 macro trends that are inescapable. One is an overwhelming superpower disengagement. If you looked at a map of the Middle East 50 or 60 years ago, you could paint every country based on its superpower alliance. You could put a French flag on Israel and a British flag on Jordan and a Russian flag on Syria and Egypt, and an American flag on Saudi Arabia, and a French one on Lebanon. And you could go on and on and on that way. And two things happened. One is almost all of those end up getting replaced by Americans. So when Israel goes from being a French client to a US client, and Jordan goes from being a British client to a US client, that does an enormous amount to calm that border down. Saudi Arabia stays an American client the entire time. Lebanon becomes something that nobody wants to be involved with at all by the 1980s, at a very high price to arrive to that conclusion. And of course, the great coup of Middle Eastern diplomacy, and the one that shook the entire region, was the shifting of Egypt from being a Soviet client to a US client. But by that time, you are now looking at a map of the Middle East that, instead of being this whole mosaic of superpower colors, really just has one color, except for Syria. And until 3 or 4 years ago, we had even come to believe that the Russian presence in Syria was somehow just this holdover from the Cold War and didn't actually mean anything. It turns out to mean a lot, by the way. And it means a lot, in particular, when you describe an Iranian effort to get to the Mediterranean. The Iranians are in the Mediterranean. And the Russian involvement in the Syrian war means that you're not going to actually rend that connection that's there. At best, we can think of ways of containing it. So 2 superpower trends. One is countries going from being allied with other states to the United States, and that's been ongoing for decades. And then another one that starts a bit later, which is just all the superpowers, including the United States, caring a lot less. Each for their own reasons. But the Middle East means less in the international game right now than it did in the 1970s or 80s, and that's probably going to continue. There are lots of reasons for that. Fracking is a big reason for that. And the hopelessness of politics in the Middle East is a big reason for that. And emerging interests elsewhere. So those are the 2 big trends that I want us to keep our focus on in terms of the global structure and how it adapts to the Middle East, that there's a much less diverse superpower involvement, that is to say, a much more American one, and that even with that American one, there's just much less involvement. At the regional level, the broad regional level, again, if I can speak in a macro trend, that's much bigger than just since 2011. The Middle East has gone from being a place of highly inegalitarian and hierarchical societies that were very, very cosmopolitan and not particularly democratic in any way, and not particularly liberal in any way, but very cosmopolitan and very diverse, to being with a large Arab Muslim majority, but with many other linguistic and ethnic and religious minorities, to being a place with very few ethnic and linguistic and religious minorities, a place where a large Arab Muslim majority has consolidated its hold on power and successfully driven out nearly everyone else except for the few minorities who were able to form a local majority and defend themselves. And I don't want to romanticize this cosmopolitan past. It's not something you would ever want to reconstruct. It was based on highly inegalitarian societies, occasionally imperialist and colonial societies, and was nothing that anybody would ever advocate today. But that's the large reality. Whatever path it's taken, more religious, more militant, more nationalist, more secular, more socialist, more whatever, that's the direction of the Middle East since 1945. The cosmopolitanism is gone, the linguistic and religious diversity is gone, and the only minority groups in the Middle East that have managed to survive have been the ones who were able to find some piece of territory where they could claim to be a majority and find the methods to actively defend themselves. That's it. Those are the two big macro trends. You can dig in and later talk about the rise of pan-Arabism or the rise of Islamic fundamentalism or the rise of all these other things. Those are details. At the narrow regional level of the Arab-Israeli dispute, you talk about the possibilities of regional cooperation. And I always get excited when I hear these things, and I always start fantasizing about all the places it could go and all the wonderful things that could happen, and how this might be a path for some sort of normalization for Israel. And I like that vision a lot. I'm, as you can tell, and I hear in your laugh, I'm very skeptical about it, and I'll tell you why. I don't think that there's any incentive for the Arab states who are cooperating with Israel on all these vital issues to take the next step. There's nothing in it for them. They get the Israeli cooperation on these issues for free, as it were. And not because Israel is particularly charitable, but because these touch on vital Israeli interests. Israel's not just going to suddenly say, oh, you know what? We wanted normalization, we didn't get it, we're going to stop caring about the Iranian nuclear program. It won't happen. And as long as the Arab states get this cooperation without ever having to be faced with the dilemmas of Arab rejectionism, without ever having to be faced, and particularly in an era of declining American significance in the region, I don't see why on earth they would care to make the next step with all of its costs. In fact, even the two Arab states that have peace treaties with Israel, Jordan and Egypt, with whom we cooperate on a vast array of issues, don't want to take that relationship out of the closet. This temptation that we get often, that's particularly fashionable in Israel, let's go for these regional approaches, that maybe that's what's going to help us solve the intractable problem of the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, largely, but also in particular the problems that are associated with the occupation and with the settlement, and more specifically with the settlement enterprise. I don't think it's going to happen. I don't think that the Arab states are going to help us end the occupation or find a defensible border with the Palestinians, just like I don't think the superpowers will, just like I don't think any of those things will. I think we're going to keep cooperating with Arab states on issues that are of vital interest to us, but that's because they are of vital interest to us. But the long-term interests aren't the same, in the sense of, yeah, of course, Israel's very concerned about what you call, and I'm not sure I sign on to the wording, the expansionist nature of Iran. Israel has a lot of concerns about Iranian policy, and has a lot of concerns about Iran exporting its revolution, and has particular concerns in some of the theaters that you mentioned. But it's not a permanent rival of Israel. Lots of things can change there. It's very different from perspective from if you're Saudi. There's a whole set of regional developments, all of which will seem impossible, and then, as with everything in the Middle East, will seem inevitable in retrospect once they happen. That could change that. There's nothing permanent about the kind of strategic posture Israel takes right now. And I also would really be careful about overstating Israel's regional posture in the Great Arab Meltdown. It looks as though, because of our concern about the Iranian nuclear program and because of our concern about Hezbollah, that we have a side in that conflict. But we really don't. If you zoom out and look at the entire regional meltdown and see it as something of an Iranian-Saudi Cold War, for the most part, Israel's posture is, as it should be, one of studied neutrality. We are watching the Middle Eastern 1914, and we're saying, we're doing our best to be Switzerland. Where something directly affects us, we're not going to hesitate. But we're not going to make the mistake we made in 1982 of being dragged into an Arab civil war. That's not going to happen again. Am I running out of time?
Yeah, maybe we should.
Okay, so I have so many other things to say, but anyway, like I said, they're all really minor. So.
All right, this is a very rich presentation. I really want to thank both of you, and I really like to get the opportunity. I'm sure you all have additional thoughts, but maybe in the course of the conversation. So please, questions, comments. There's so much to talk about, and so much very stimulating analysis. So please go ahead. You want to start?
Oh gosh, there's so much. But one is you began with the issue of miscalculation in '67. Everybody miscalculated. I've just finished Oren's book on the war, reading it very slowly and carefully, and it seemed to me that not everybody miscalculated. Amir didn't miscalculate. He ran into catastrophe, but he didn't miscalculate. He knew exactly what he wanted, and he got it. And Alon didn't miscalculate. Alon knew exactly what he wanted, and he got it. That was one. Two, at one point, he said something about if Israel does something, the Palestinians, under pressure, the Palestinians may come to recognize that they're serious. There really is a question. I'm a committed Zionist. Is Israel really serious about any of this? My sense is it's not. That it's not the same Israel as 30 years ago. It's so far to the right. And I don't see a science that it can move back toward the center. You mentioned the religious right and you let it drop. There's a demographic problem there we all know about. There's a political problem. These are not rational actors. And they're not educated actors, as Benny Morris made clear the other day. They're as ideologically committed to their God-drenched goal as the worst Arabs are, it seems to me. And I don't know how you can be so optimistic. It's very top-down, your description of everything. And my sense is, yeah, top-down, but we've been listening to top-down for a long time. It hasn't worked. There's a bottom-up issue. We all talk about the Arab street, but what about the Israeli street? I don't hear about the Israeli street. It's bottom-up. It's extraordinarily powerful. Netanyahu swings with whoever the street is. He's hardly, at this point, a major actor. And the street seems to be going right and right and right and right to me. I don't see any sign for your optimism.
Okay. Well, I'll start with two things. I mean, one is perhaps negates some of the open analysis or the open direct analysis that I'm trying to offer, which is that I'm the father of a 19-year-old who in another month is about to go into the Army. I have a 15-year-old who's about to go into the Army. I like my home and where it is. I don't like missiles falling on my city as they did recently. So the optimism, it's not, I don't consider myself an optimist per se, and I guess what I was trying to stress, and perhaps I didn't make it as clear, is that I see the situation as quite bleak. Given that it's a bleak situation, I think there are still things we have to do. And that's actually, there's a battle that's happening inside of Israel. There's a battle that's happening, I think, global, certainly in the United States, and I think it's part of perhaps a broader global phenomena that is sweeping the world in this particular moment, which is a fight between people who are looking for hope and people who are more focused on pessimism and selfishness. But I'll leave that to the side. In terms of so I don't think that there is, I think there's a lot of reason to think that there is, that it's a bleak situation. Having said that, I also think that one of the elements within Israel is that Israel has never really defined its center. We have a left, we have a right. One of the things that the Oslo process offered the Israeli polity an opportunity to do, and it did not do this successfully, is finally deal with the Israel-Palestine issue and deal ultimately with the constitution of the state. Israel formally doesn't have a constitution. We don't have our Knesset is functioning without that. And we don't really have a constitution of what it means to be an Israeli, and that's an open question. I think the fight has gotten much worse in Israel. I think the right has gotten much stronger. I think a distressing element of exactly how bad it is can be found in the discourse around a soldier, Alor Azaria, who was convicted of shooting a Palestinian who stabbed soldiers, but shooting him while he was wounded and killing him. I think there is an ongoing fight over where this center is. I think that the interesting political dynamics right now are happening precisely within that center. I don't have a tremendous amount of hope with the existing actors that are trying to occupy that center, but that's where I see that there could be change. It's also just, and one final point with that, it's also why I think the efforts to engage civil society, both Palestinian, but in the case of the question that you're asking, the Israeli civil society are precisely beneficial because they are meant to, let's try to solve that issue and see if we can with a question mark, see if we can get to a place where there will be an Israeli center that's willing to move forward. And I don't, that answer that's an open question. But Shani, I think you have more to say about the Israeli polity, if you want to.
Should I say?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, the two things I left out,
yes.
and actually now I realize I maybe should have said them. One was about the importance of ambiguity, and I think that's crucial in the diplomatic issue. It's crucial in the other issue. I wouldn't want a constitutional convention that defines what it is to be an Israeli. I don't think you can do that without forcing something on people. I think what works in Israel, and actually what works in every country that we know of, is several overlapping consensuses of what these things are. So I didn't like the sentence in the paper, this is the farthest right government Israel's ever had. I know people love saying this. I think it's empirically wrong. I think it's demonstrably wrong. I think saying it and saying that Israel has moved to the right has a certain rhetorical benefit. It serves a certain cognitive dissonance resolution. It's not borne out, not in the polling data, not in the data of the positions. You today have, if you counted, for example, on the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, what percentage or what number of Israeli members of Knesset are in favor of two states? You have a majority. If you went back to the left-wing government of Yitzhak Rabin, you didn't even have more than maybe 5 or 10. And if you looked at the polling data, you have something very similar. You have something similar on almost every issue, whether it's issues about democracy, minorities, things like that. There is a long Jewish tradition from Jeremiah onwards of always saying, this is it, this is the end, and there's an entire Israeli civil society that is dependent on always making the case that democracy is about to collapse right now. We had in Israel until the 1990s a real debate between seemingly intelligent people about whether or not Israel could actually hold on to the West Bank for the long term. And whether that was a good thing or not. Not just religious crazies. I mean, this was something people argued about, voted about, and that split the country in two. Today, except for the party of the settler right, which got 8 seats in the last Knesset out of 120, so we're talking about 7.5% of the vote, there's nobody in Israel who's committed to the idea that we should be there at all costs. You have an overwhelming majority that's willing to that's willing to leave in a peace agreement. You even have probably a bare majority that's willing to leave in the absence of one, given the right conditions. In fact, in 2006, you had a Knesset that was elected with an overwhelming majority on the platform of unilaterally leaving. So I don't think that helps us analytically, and I think it excuses too many other more difficult questions. It excuses questions about what's happening on the other side as well in public opinion. Although even there, by the way, if you look at polling data, pretty steady across decades, just like the Israeli ones. There's a few punctuated shifts. There's a few massive shifts in both Arab opinion and Israeli opinion. In Arab opinion, in the mid-1970s, there's a massive shift to a more moderate stance. In Israeli opinion, in the mid-1990s, those are pretty much it. Not much has moved since then. And in terms of governments, I mean, I can name a few governments that were more right-wing than this one. I don't know how we'd measure it. I wouldn't want to go back to the government that we've had in 1981 that built 70 new settlements and that invaded Lebanon. I wouldn't want to go to the government of 1990, the short-lived government that had Moledet in the coalition, that gave Israel a bunch of pointless, high-profile disputes with the United States at the time, and others. So that's as far as that. And I could talk about ambiguity, but I don't want to take anybody else's time. Sorry.
Any other few minutes for? Go ahead, please.
You mentioned that there's a great divide in Palestinian leadership, and specifically that there's mistrust amongst the Palestinian Authority and things like that. Can one of you speak of the Islamic movement in Israel and risks and opportunities regarding that movement as a Muslim movement in a Jewish state?
A bit without specific data is that there's on the one hand been some what I think is there are some unfortunate steps taken by the current government to outlaw the northern branch of the Islamic movement, which is associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, Hamas. It fits in that broad framework, and I think that's at a time when the Palestinian population, which makes up about 20% of Israel's citizenship, and is by no means wholly adherent at all to the Islamic movement. It sends an unfortunate signal of exclusion. But having said that, I think there are, and again, I don't feel like I can give a full answer to your question, but there are some very interesting efforts that are happening right now. Again, being led by civil society leaders. One of them is Rabbi Michael Melchior, who is leading an effort. He has a number of initiatives. One is a more grassroots initiative that's bringing people together from the right and the left, but also religious, secular, as well as Muslim, from a broad range of views, together with Jews from a broad range of views, and also an effort that is much more interesting, where he's been working for a number of years to bring Muslim leaders from at a very high level. We're talking senior clerics from Iraq down through to Egypt, together with senior leaders, religious leaders from Israel, including most recently there was a meeting that was hosted by the Spanish government. I think this was 6 months ago. That included Israel's chief rabbi. So there is an effort to bring a leadership together that includes the leaders from the Islamic movement. And then just one short. It's anecdotal that I can story that I can share with you. Is David mentioned an initiative that I started together with some colleagues that uses water sports and kayaking in particular to create a platform for dialogue and discourse. As part of that, I went on a 273-kilometer paddle down the coast of Israel, which was a lot of fun. If you come to Israel, I'll take you kayaking. But one of the things that was that conversation that was fascinating was I by chance met a former mayor from al-Fahim, which is the largest Arab town inside of Israel, Palestinian town. He was from the northern branch of the Muslim of the Islamic movement, and he was the former mayor. The movement had just been so it's actually over a year ago. It had just been made illegal. And I was fascinated by the extent to the openness that he expressed. Again, this is anecdotal, but he as a leader was saying, I want there to be a two-state solution. I want to stay in the town that I live in. I want to continue living here. I want to see Israelis living here. I want to see this person who has fond memories of going to Tel Aviv. He was referring to an earlier part of the conversation with an elderly man who was describing a time when the Arabs where he was living Arab citizens of Israel were under military rule still. But he has more memories of going to Tel Aviv. I don't know if you went back to the time, if you would have such warm memories then. But there's a greater level of openness. And here actually I'd like to I fully agree with the need for that ambiguity that lets people who clearly disagree on many levels work together. So let's hope that wiser minds will prevail.
Any other questions? Yeah.
This is for Mr. Moore. So I apologize if I mispronounced that, but at the end of your response, you said something about not viewing Israel as a central player in the greater Arab meltdown. And I'm just wondering if you could clarify if you think it's possible to isolate Israel from the rest of the Middle East, because from my understanding, it's very central to many of the other issues going on, whether or not Israel is directly itself involved. So I'm just curious about that.
I don't know if it's possible. It's very difficult.
Because
But as an aspiration, particularly in this current cycle of state meltdown, which I think we're going to be living with for at least the next couple of years, the aftermath of 2011, that every effort should be made by Israel to quarantine itself from wherever this meltdown hits next. That means that, for example, what we've managed to do on our northern borders with Syria and Lebanon, Israel has responded when it needed to very, very pinpoint provocations, but always in a way that doesn't escalate. It's blocked where it could weapons shipments going from Syria to Lebanon, but it's never responded to any incident, even incidents where we had casualties on our side, even incidents where in earlier situations we might have been tempted to overreact by making a big fuss, either publicly or by taking a big demonstrative military action. It hasn't, bombed a runway in Beirut airport or anything like it did in July of 2006. Wherever it can to minimize its involvement and the perception that it has a side in this. Just to compare, by the way, the forces of the United States and some of its allies right now are actively involved in theater in Yemen and Libya and Syria and Iraq, and occasionally on different sides. I always ask myself, is there like an American pilot who's just gone and been strafing targets in Yemen on the, I think in Yemen the United States is on essentially the pro-Saudi side, and in Iraq it's on essentially on the pro-Iranian side, and in Libya it's been on different sides. And I ask myself, does the same pilot get sent on multiple missions where he's I mean, and in each of those theaters, by the way, there's a very good reason why the United States has involved itself on one side. It's not complete madness on the micro level. On the macro level, I think it certainly is. So I think it's absolutely crucial for Israel to, as much as it can, limit its involvement. There are situations that are on Israel's borders where it has to do something, and then of course there's the big horribleness of our presence in the West Bank, both the military and the civilian presence, which takes an already difficult conflict and makes it into something that, for people on both sides, feels like an existential threat and something that's always can explode at any moment, even as I was saying, however complacent we are about the current quiet. And that's something Israel needs to take active steps as well to minimize the friction points, minimize the possible places. We're not Switzerland with Alps. I said, it would be lovely to be Switzerland in 1914 and just say, let's wait this out, call us in 30 years, which is what they did. That worked out well for them, sort of. We don't have that option, but that needs to be the aspiration.
I want to thank, once again, Daniel Sherman and Shani Moore for a really stimulating and informative interaction, and I hope you all felt, as I did, that we've learned a lot in the last hour and a half. So thank you.